concern within the community around kind of whether they should be taking the second vaccines. So then I think there needs to be some really sensitive work around working with the community, and particularly I know Elspeth is linked into Kate Wignall. I think it'd be very useful if there'd be kind of Kate kind of follows up with Elspeth about these issues and how we can work with the community, particularly kind of the visually impaired community, because there's anxieties in the community at the moment. We know that we've got poor take up of vaccines in our area, and we need to be encouraging people, but we also need to be addressing these issues as they come along. So it's kind of really to raise those as kind of a key concern, particularly at the time when we want to make sure vaccine take up is increasing in particularly vulnerable communities.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you, John. I'm sure that that can be picked up in the presentations we'll hear from, and as you say, with the officers outside the meeting as well. Clearly, it's always tragic to hear of people who suffer with significant illness, whatever the cause. And of course, we do know there's a very rare occasions with AZ vaccine on, particularly AZ vaccine for younger people. We also know that is a 1 in a millions type risk, whereas the risk of serious illness and death through COVID obviously depends on your age and illness, comorbidities, but it is much higher. And of course, the illness is associated with blood clots, which is often the thing which is talked about in terms of the vaccine problems. So again, not wishing to diminish at all from those individual cases, we can't really comment on them, but just a bit of perspective in that sense. And that's what we need to pick up on the communications, really, isn't it? In terms of, how you manage risk, how you view risk, and how we help people work their way through those sort of deliberations before they come forward and hopefully have the vaccine. And of course, we've changed now. AZ isn't used. Anyone under 40 gets Pfizer now. Those complications are even rarer on a second dose if you haven't had a problem with your first dose, virtually unseen. So anyway, that's just a bit of context. So thank you for that. Let's move on then to the vaccine update. We've actually got Siobhan to do the update, Siobhan Harper, and also we've got today an extra piece on the evaluation of the vaccine programme. I'm not sure, Siobhan, you're going to cover whether we want to have a break between the two presentations. I'm not sure if Anna's doing the second one, but I'll leave it with you to manage that.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Yes, Anna will be speaking to the evaluation part of today's presentation. So with that in mind, I won't dwell too much on the, sorry, a big bee's just flown in my room. I won't dwell too much on each individual slide or in the pack. Thank you for your comments, John. I think they're very pertinent, really, to some of the kind of challenge that remains for us in City and Hackney. And we will definitely pick that up with Elspeth. I can update you in the sense that we had a very detailed discussion yesterday at the steering group, actually, about communications and the concerns that still exist, I suppose, and that maybe have developed as time has gone on since the programme started. And I think that's reflected in our concerns at the moment about the number of people who haven't come forward for their second dose, which is quite considerably high, which is a worry for us. And I guess the key thing for us at the moment is, and in the context of variants of concern, etc., which Chris will pick up as well later on in this morning's meeting. We still have around 17,000 people between 1 to 9 cohorts, so the most vulnerable people who remain unvaccinated in our population. There are obviously a multitude of reasons behind why that might be, and our approach really has been to consider that as our priority, our remaining priority, whilst we know that the programme has been opening up nationally to younger and younger cohorts, and those who can self-serve are actively booking slots, and that's happening quite considerably. We had a really detailed discussion yesterday around that remaining our priority focus locally, and any kind of surge planning and surge activity that we want to instigate will be with that in mind. So I guess what our sort of consolidation of our planning at the moment is around 3 populations. The 1 to 9 cohort, we have got some extra capacity available at St Leonard's Hospital and at the Homerton Hospital as well, which will be on Thursdays and Saturdays, which will be again probably aiming to support a more self-serving population and a more is removing access barriers by being walk-in available, certainly at the St Leonard's site. We are pushing hard on distributing further vaccine to our colleagues in pharmacy who've been doing really, really well in terms of making vaccines available to people locally. But our 1 to 9 cohort work is really going to be the focus of more detailed planning with our PCN colleagues, really, and offering targeted sessions for vaccine uptake in very specific geographical locations where we know from the data analysis that we've done, we still have those cohorts of populations that remain unvaccinated. Looking to do continued work with people through primary care around reoffering the vaccine. So recently we offered all the people in the 1 to 9 cohort who were unvaccinated a further go at a vaccine, but offering Pfizer instead. And we've had 900 people accept that offer. So, you know, it's just making sure that we keep that momentum going and keep focusing on that type of work. And we had a targeted event in Springfield PCN, I think it was last weekend, where about 230 people were vaccinated at the weekend. So it's going to be more of that work, really, more distribution of making it as available and as local and as visible as possible. That's still complemented by continued outreach work, all of which is in the pack in terms of the work that's going on with voluntary and community sector organisations, and continuing to be visible locally and doing that engagement work to try to have the detailed conversations around the hesitancy concerns. And you know, we want to have another look at some of that detail, because as John says, as things have evolved, you know, people's concerns have changed slightly or become more complex, and we need to be really on top of our communications and our messaging in respect of those issues and being clear about that. I think then the other priorities really for us are targeted work on carers. You'll see that in the pack. So our colleagues in particularly in Hackney are doing some very targeted work around home care staff who again remain quite a low number of uptake around vaccination. So that's a priority for us. And then also additionally, there's some data in the pack around the numbers of people who are homeless that have been vaccinated, which was talked about last time, and I promised I'd bring back for Randall. So I'll pause there, and it's up, I guess, Mark, whether you want to take questions on that element now and then come to Anna, or do you want to hear from Anna first?
Well, I see a hand's gone up already. Okay. One comment I had is that dispersed model you're saying within practices, although that Spring Hill's great, it's over 200. In fact, some of the practices their numbers have gone up quite high sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's quite small. I speak from experience because we're doing the practice I work at, we're doing a second dose for 210 people or so on Saturday morning. So even those small ones sometimes get a bit bigger. So all of that is not always just about 1 or 2 vials. Sometimes it is about a larger offer. So with that bit of extra, let's go to the questions now, and then we'll bring Anna in. So Rob Chapman and then Chris Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Hot. I just wondered, are we seeing much evidence of people having a sort of favouritism between different sorts of vaccines, and is that a big issue? I mean, thinking, they've had maybe one of them, and they're because of some of the press stories, they're reluctant to take another one or that one. And I've even seen press stories about the possibility of mix and match. I know that's probably not clinically approved at the moment, but I just wonder what sort of pressure you're getting from people who have shown extreme favouritism for one vaccine or the other.
Sure, I'll take 2 at a time, actually, because I think that'll be a good way of grouping it. So, Chris Kennedy, do you want to ask your question as well?
Yep, thanks very much. Really good to hear about those 900 extra in 1 to 9 who took up the vaccine offer when they were specifically told it was Pfizer. And I just wondered if we knew how many of those people had previously declined. Were they all decliners, or what percentage of those? Thank you.
Sean.
Thank you. So yes, there is an issue about, so obviously now the main available vaccine is Pfizer, and that everybody under 40 is being offered Pfizer. So in that respect, that issue has kind of taken care of itself, I suppose. But there are people who are reluctant to take AZ as a second dose, irrespective of what Mark has said, that if you've had no effects with the first dose, it's highly unlikely you're going to have effects with the second. And so what our providers do is offer a very detailed clinical kind of conversation with somebody, should they have that concern, to see if they will take the second, to facilitate them taking the same dose or the same version the second time. But there have been instances where, because the person has been so insistent that they don't want to take the AZ, that Pfizer can be offered. So that has happened. The decliner issue, I actually don't know off the top of my head, Chris, whether they were all officially decliners, but I guess they would have been within that cohort that were either deferred or declined. Some people have, the feedback we've had from some people is that this is exactly what they were waiting for. They were waiting to be able to get Pfizer rather than AZ. So, I mean, it's a shame, because AZ has kind of, it's got an image problem, I suppose, in that respect, because people's anxieties are alive. So that's tough. But obviously we know the evidence is otherwise, but it's something that we're obviously having to manage.
Great, thanks, Sean. So I'll take Randall Anderson and Haren Patel. Randall.
Thank you. And thank you for the information on the vaccinating of the homeless. Clearly, there's been some real progress, especially in a couple of the sites. But it doesn't say anything about sort of ongoing, and they are still well below where they ought to be. So are there additional planned vaccination efforts there?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the work is does continue, and we have got other providers as well as the Excel and the offer from our one of our roving GPs who's been doing that work. So it's an ongoing piece of work, really, in terms of continued offer to those populations, particularly now, as I think as well that the find and treat team are also part of that picture. So it will be something that's continuously made available. But again, I can bring updates on this as a regular part of the data, Randall, because we do keep this collected regularly.
Thank you. I'm going to go, Sean, your enthusiasm got a bit. I'll do two at a time still. So I'm going to go to Haren and to Honor, and then we'll take two questions. So Haren.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to go back to John's points, which was raised earlier. So as it is, we've got a lot of decliners for various reasons, and John's point is valid. There might be a connection, there might not be a connection. We don't know that. I think it has to be, I'm sure it has been reported to appropriate channels to be investigated ASAP to alleviate the anxiety, because we don't want to get hold of that anxiety during this period. Otherwise, we'll have a big problem.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Haren. Honor.
Thank you. Thank Siobhan, brilliant report. Thank you. I just wondered if there was hesitancy amongst pregnant women and what we were doing about that, because there's been an awful lot of chat on Mumsnet and Net Mums about the danger of the vaccination. So I just wondered if we were doing a specific piece of comms and whether we'd seen any hesitancy there. Thank you.
Yeah, we are doing a specific piece of work. Oh, sorry, Mark. Is that two? We are doing a specific piece of work on pregnant women. So Amy's leading that work. Chris was involved. I think Chris is on the call, but we are planning a specific event with Orthodox Jewish women. They're working in partnership with the Confederation at the LVS to do a targeted event around that community and pregnant women. We have done a lot of communication around it, and the details of that I'm not as up to speed with, because I wasn't involved in the discussions this week. So I don't know if Chris wanted to add anything else. I see he's put his hand up, so he may.
Sure. I mean, I think the pathway has got a lot easier now, because it is Pfizer that needs to, or Moderna that needs to be used. And the national booking system didn't originally allow you to differentiate, but it now does. Obviously, as we're over 25s, that's now a lot more of the pregnant women. The other issue I think that we're looking at is just in terms of there are a small number of issues that often come up, and people want to have conversations around fertility and transfer of the vaccine through the placebo. So there was a very successful event run in Havering by the midwives and some of the other clinical leads, and we are looking now to replicate something very similar and base it in Hackney. But as Siobhan has highlighted, we're also quite keen to look at using some of the flexibilities around multi-generational events, and I think the first one is going to be on the 20th of June, probably targeted particularly at the sort of Stamford Hill area, where I think we're going to be able to get about 300 to 400 people vaccinated, but looking at the pregnant woman being kind of the index, and then everybody else who lives in that household. So yes, I think you're right that there was a degree of hesitancy. I think that hesitancy for most groups is actually going down. We've got some national surveys and London surveys, and also the outreach that we've been undertaking does show that actually there is more confidence in the vaccine. There is certainly still questions that need to be asked and answered, but actually in general terms, people are now actually much keener to take the vaccine. I think the variants of concern, opening up the potential now for travel. Some of the European countries now have made it a requirement. France did yesterday that you have to have both vaccinations in order to be able to travel in a much easier way. So I think those are going to make some differences to vaccine hesitancy. And just the fact that we've had over 110,000 people vaccinated in Hackney with the first dose, and obviously many millions across the country.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I'm going to propose that, Jake, you have the last question at this stage, and then I'm going to turn to Anna to do and Siobhan to do the presentation around the evaluation piece. Jake, has your hand gone down?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for an excellent, concise presentation as always, Siobhan. Given that people have choice now, and as humans we love choice, I do suspect that if we were to be very public about the fact that people can choose Pfizer over AZ, there would be a ripple effect in terms of getting that out and I think many of those who would be previously hesitant would see it as their time to step forward. And I'm just wondering if we can be very public through the community champions and voluntary organisations about that, or whether you're sort of only doing it when people ask. Because I think if people think they've got choice, they feel like they have more control and therefore more likely to come forward.
Yeah, Chris has put his hand up. He probably wants to come in on that as well. But I think that's a very good point. We certainly did offer choice as part of that communication directly with the patients who were so far in the 1 to 9s. We were very explicit that we were offering Pfizer. I don't know if we've done anything broader in terms of, publicity broadly saying that. But I think the messaging has been quite transparent that certain age groups are only going to get the offer of the vaccine other than AZ. But Chris, did you want to say something on that?
I mean, nationally, they are requesting, not quite requiring, but certainly ever increasingly requesting that if you're over 40, you should be getting AstraZeneca because of vaccine supply. I think the reality on the ground, and you have got in the pack, I've seen the note about the mass vaccination event. So obviously something happened at Twickenham and that was well represented. And there is plans for something very soon locally in northeast London, in the London Stadium. That will be a single vaccination offer of Pfizer. Now, it would be fantastic if the people that are particularly at risk, so we've got about 17,000 in Hackney, if they attended that event, because they're eligible to attend that event, it's not restricted to under 40s, but if they attended that event, they will definitely get Pfizer. So I think there is a kind of a little bit of a mixed messages around we should be deploying AstraZeneca to the over 40s. It is still safe. The risk of thrombosis is very low. But as you rightly say, some people have clearly made up their mind. And if you have exercised that right to say, I do not want AstraZeneca, then actually the system, there are some options in the system. And obviously the mass vaccination events like the one that's coming up quite shortly, if you register for that and can attend it, then you will get Pfizer. So there are some ways of actually ensuring that. But I think it's entirely appropriate what has been done in primary care by sending out that text message. If people wanted Pfizer, there was then a conversation with the GP. If AstraZeneca was more appropriate, then that would have been offered. And ultimately, if people are saying absolutely, I only want this, then you have to take that into consideration when you're balancing the risk of COVID infection against vaccine supply.
I'm gonna have to check.
Can I just quickly come back on that, Mark?
Yeah,
I think
time's up running out.
Obviously, the formal offer, when you get your text and it says you'll be able to have Pfizer, it was more that can we start some dialogue that gives communities the sense that they can own the outcome of their vaccination, i.e. they feel
I think that's the point. I think that's the point, really, Jake, is that supply is out of our control. That's the thing, is that we can't guarantee that to people because supply is not dictated. That's a national thing. Supply is pushed out nationally. So you get what comes, really. That's some of the difficulty that we've got in terms of setting expectations. So, we couldn't give people the expectation that they can turn up and there's a choice on the day, because you just can't guarantee that. That's the difficulty. But okay. I mean, we do know at the moment that Pfizer is, well, from July, that's likely to be the main vaccine, but that's in conjunction with the age groups, so in a way, like Chris says, it's about being opportunistic for people, I guess. One of the things that we are looking at doing is kind of producing a sort of situation report for the whole system, so that on a daily basis we can understand what's available, so in all of the settings. And I guess what we would like to do is be able to be really clear in terms of a public facing version of that, so people can understand what's available where, and that we may be able to have some flexibility with our colleagues in community champions, etc., to think about, well, what vaccine are they using in those settings? We might be able to do something around that, I think.
Okay, sure, great. I'm going to move us on because we are nearly towards past. And Phil, can I ask you to hold your question? We can obviously come back to questions after we've heard from Anna in the evaluation. I think the supply issue cannot be underestimated, really. And that's just the international supply of Pfizer coming into the UK issue. Then it gets pushed, and the more that gets pushed to Greater Manchester, there's less to go somewhere else, and et cetera, et cetera. So that is a very important context that you're talking in how we work within that. But that's been the case throughout the entire vaccination campaign. So Anna, over to you for a couple of minutes to highlight the evaluation report, and then we'll take some more questions in that about that, and also anything else that we want to cover.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. It's quite a dense paper. I will try not to talk too fast when summarising it. But yeah, if I go too fast and miss things, then people can ask through them, or I'm happy to talk through whatever bits either here or offline. So this is the proposal for how we evaluate the whole of the vaccine programme. So some bits of it are better developed at the moment, noting that we're starting the programme of community grants. So that's pushed that bit to be more developed at the moment. But the aim is that we would do a similar thing of how we measure some of the outcomes within the evaluation framework for pharmacies, GPs, other settings. So the aim of this is that we bring together all of the interventions that we're doing, both the vaccine provision bit as well as the pre-engagement element. We have set out an outcomes framework to form part of that evaluation. So then noting that the evaluation is looking at whether the programme has achieved its set goals, as well as how and why this might or might not have happened. So we need to bring together all of the interventions, enable us to measure outputs from those and outcomes, so that we can look at value, and so that we shape the development of the programme over the very short term. So we would hope that this would generate findings so that we could say which elements of the programme are the best value, which are achieving the best outcomes, so that we can ensure sustainability of the most effective provision and interventions. So the outcomes framework that you've got has been set out. Sorry, I don't know what number it is on your agenda, but the first kind of graphic that you get is set against the WHO social processes to vaccination model. And the point of that really is to say that we can't just measure jabs in arms. We have to think both ends of this. So firstly, that actually the jabs in arms is neither here nor there really, because what we're trying to do is prevent harm from COVID. So it's keeping that in mind, that actually what we need to be measuring is overall and inequalities in cases, severe cases, and mortality from COVID, i.e. they've got to be the jabs in the arms of the people who might be getting it, and we're preventing that bit of community transmission and morbidity. But we also are saying that changing people's attitudes and confidence and opportunity to have the vaccination is a key outcome in itself. So as you move people along that process to being more confident and feeling more informed, and that resonating throughout the community, that's also a positive outcome. So you can see the outcomes framework that we've set out with a series of I statements, and we're just and you can also then see, following that outcomes framework, some detail about the measures and the table. But then on the last couple of pages, you can see how we might monitor the impact of some of that. So the detailed table on the kind of penultimate page or so is about how we might measure some of those at community events or pharmacies, etc. And we've developed that resident survey for the community groups that should be going out to groups today, and we can change that as we go along as needed. But it's also then to set out that we need to be, we're obviously monitoring the vaccine rates and monitoring those by a number of different equalities dimension, as well as household and resident area. But it's, as I say, to make the point again of this all needs to be monitored against the impact that this is having against harm from COVID across different population groups. I'll stop talking there. I'm conscious that was speedy, but I want to keep time for questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. Well, we've had a look at the paper. I just want one thing is when is the work starting, or has it started, and when might we see some sort of reporting of what you find out?
So it started within the community grants programme. As I say, they've started work this week, and will start there doing various things, but they have a line survey that they will all be using for different interventions. And so, yeah, within a few weeks, I guess, we should start to see some results from that. There is obviously the bit that needs to be developed of this evaluation of how we get similar information to that from people accessing the vaccine in other settings, or accessing pre-engagement information events in other settings. So that needs some thought, and that needs some thought how we use already stretched capacity to do some of that. And I'm conscious of that, but yeah, so that needs work on.
Great. OK, thanks, Anna. So I'll go back to Phil Glanville a second. I just bring people's attention to John Gee, obviously put a question in the chat about the perceived efficacy of Pfizer and Moderna against AZ. And Chris, thank you for putting that link into the most up-to-date evidence, which is actually very reassuring on that point, and a link to the article in the BMJ. Chris, when you come back and speak, you may want to elaborate on that a bit, but not just yet, because I'm going to bring in Phil Glanville for his question. He's been hanging on for ages, and you'll be, I'm sure, responding soon anyway. Phil.
Thanks, Mark, and actually it made sense to bring me in after Anna, so thank you for that. I didn't think it did at the time, but actually some of the questions I had were answered. One thing I just do think there's quite a lot of clinical conversations I would talk about taking place in the chat and on the meeting, and I just wonder if there's a way, given the meeting isn't really set up to respond to some of those, and it's recorded in public, we just sort of need to be really aware of that and what that means to people that might be watching, because not all of us are obviously clinically trained, and people are commenting on efficacy and all of that sort of thing. On the questions, I think the monitoring is really, well, I'll start with an incredible set of reports and activities, and I'm just really pleased that the ramping up of the champions work and the using every practical route around expanding in-borough vaccine provision is taking place. I think it's really, really impressive, and I think the outcomes framework is really impressive. It seems to be that the ICB or the Outbreak Board is asked to sort of endorse the methodology set out in the outcomes framework, but then the reporting would only go as far, perhaps, as the vaccine steering group. And I just wonder whether or not I'm inferring that, but whether or not basically the outcomes could be monitored here. At the Outbreak Board. And my second question on that is, we often mark our own homework very effectively when we talk about a recent event. So we've had incredible pop-ups at John Scott with the Haredi community, and we talk about hundreds of people that have been vaccinated. We've captured the outreach work with undocumented migrants. We've got very effective reporting here in sort of both types of reports on homeless households. But as then time passes, they just go into the general figures, with the exception of some of the very vulnerable groups. And I just wonder, in that reporting, do we have the capacity to kind of capture some of these alternative routes, so that when we look back, we can say, well, the bus did this, the work we can did that. I think it's really important. Because if we were doing it again next year with kind of boosters, we would want to go, well, that didn't really work. That was poor value for money. That was absolutely excellent. And I think that sort of thing is, and the final question is the capacity to sort of look forward and back with this outcomes framework. So are we only going to sort of capture the information that would populate this sort of going forward, or do we have the collective capacity to go back and start to sort of populate it with some of that information? But from Anna and Siobhan and the team, just incredible work.
Can I come in, Mark, on the basis of those three questions? Well, and it's quite quick then. I think probably my answer, Phil, might be yes, yes, and yes. So yes, definitely reporting can come to the local outbreak control board. Sorry, my bad of not including it. Absolutely, I agree. I think we have to bring it all together to say what was provided via each different route and what that meant for different underserved populations and those at higher risk of harm. And as you said, use that learning going forward, and that, yes, I would hope that we would be able to work to pull that together so that we can do the learning for the future.
And I just would add as well, I think that what we felt very strongly yesterday about when we talked about this was that we want to use this learning more broadly. It's not just about COVID in a way, because we need to think, how can we learn in terms of how we deliver services more across the board, that actually we really need to do things quite differently, especially if we're going to really have an impact on inequalities. So it's an opportunity to think much bigger, really, when we get the learning from it.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna move us on because of time. Chris, I appreciate that you that in the chat that Sandra Husbands obviously had also given her apologies. So sorry for not noting that at the beginning, and you're standing in her stead. And also Councillor Antoinette Bramble also given her apologies, we should note. We're moving on to the data intelligence now. Deanna normally gives us a slideshow. We've probably only got about 5 minutes to be able to take questions today, 5-10 minutes on the whole piece. Shall I hand to you, Chris, or straight to Deanna? How do you want to do it?
Diana first, and then I'll address some of the issues that we've just been discussing around effectiveness of the vaccination, but also just give you a summary of overall what's been going on in COVID and our activities. But I think if Diana sets the scene with the data.
Great. And will you be able to then cover off the control plan highlights when you speak? Yeah, great. That's super. Okay, and over to you.
Please let me know if you can see my screen yet.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, it doesn't work in the same way as Google Meet. So the news are that we have seen a sustained increase in the number of cases week on. So for the past couple of weeks or so, we've seen more and more cases weekly. Unlike in some instances where it's a result of increased testing, for us, it looks like there is actually an increased transmission within the community because we're seeing increasing positivity rates as well. So it's not just because we're doing more tests, we're picking up more cases, but it's also for every 100 tests, we're seeing more coming back positive. I'm just showing you a few maps here that I appreciate probably very small, but I'm just going to summarize what's happening. So it's not just Hackney, but in London overall. You can see the case rate over here. So that's the incidence rate that I was just saying. So we are here. We are in this range, 25 to 50. So we are amber. City of London is red, but it's always very small numbers. So it tends to fluctuate quite a bit. However, the City of London is seeing now higher rates, so over 50. And a lot of the boroughs are now in red. So in that range, 50 to 150. Only a few are in green, but the number of cases, like I said, is increasing. So you can see the case rate change. So proportionately from the last week, by how much the incidence rate has increased. And you can see a lot of boroughs are already over 100% increase. That's the darkest red, and us including, so Hackney and the City of London. This is not a good trend at all. So, and while the positivity rate here is still looks like it's green for the entire of London, so under 4%, that looks at just the PCR tests and combined pillar 1 and 2. When you look pillar 2, the community testing, it's much higher. So the overall positivity is diluted a little bit because we're taking account of pillar 1 as well. Now I'm going to move on and present just really quickly how our rates are looking. So overall, still compared to this peak there in January and December, of course, we're not looking that bad. But like I said, it's been increasing week on. So it's now around 28 actually. So with the most recent data, this has been updated on Monday, and we're going to be updating it today. And in terms of the age group, so it seems to be driven by the increase in infections among the youngest ages, especially young adults. So 19 to 24 have the highest rates, and unsurprisingly so, because these are the residents who have not yet been vaccinated. We see, fortunately, that in our oldest and the most vulnerable age groups, we're only seeing a few cases a week. So in the last week, it was just 1 case in that age group. Which is reassuring, but again, because of the increasing rates of transmittability in the community, and we also have new variants of concern which are circulating. So with the last data that I looked at, about 50 cases that we had in the last week were variants of concern, and the Delta variant, the Indian variant, dominating that. Almost exclusively all cases are Delta. So that has increased a lot. So previously we haven't seen such a high proportion of our cases being variants of concern. The picture is now changing, so that's another worry, I guess. And in terms of how that looks across the borough, so some of the areas are seeing higher rates, and that includes Hackney Wick and Dalston and Debevoise. The rates there are between 50 and 100 per 100,000 population. That has really changed compared to just a few weeks back, where most of the wards were under 25 per 100,000. So again, increasing rates in some of the areas of Hackney. Some of them, actually, I have to mention, were subject to targeted testing. So it might be, again, that it is a combination of things why the rates are high in like places like Dalston, for instance. And how do we compare? Because this is basically ranking, right? So if rates increasing across London, then we might see that we are not as bad, but that we need to consider that the rates have increased everywhere. Even though we're not looking bad in the ranking table, we are seeing an increased transmission of the infection in the community still. And like I said, so in terms of testing, we've seen a slight dip. This might be to do with the half term or just generally reduction in testing. Sorry, it's just refreshing itself. Just because it tends to fluctuate, as some weeks are higher, some weeks are lower, just natural fluctuation. But like I said, the positivity rate, which is the orange line, you can see it's kind of rising quite steeply right now. It was flat for a very long time, but it's increasing. So last Monday was 1.3, now it's more around 1.7. So it is increasing daily, basically, not to scare anyone. And the last one is around vaccination, but I think we have discussed that quite a bit, just with Siobhan and Anna. This is just showing overall rates of vaccination. You can see that there is quite a bit of a variation, but it also varies given that which cohort you're looking at. The table here summarizes the proportion of people vaccinated by age group and how that changed from the last week. You can see that, of course, because now the focus is on the youngest age groups, and they are the ones with who have not yet been vaccinated. The highest increase are in those age groups. And lastly, deaths from COVID. So we haven't seen any for a few weeks, which is reassuring. But again, given that the new variants of concern are circulating and starting to dominate our cases, that might change. So we need to keep a close eye on that.
Great.
Any questions?
Thanks. That's very helpful. Chris, I'm going to hand straight back to you again to pick up on 1 or 2 points that you want to cover off, and also just pick up the control plan highlights that you want to say. So over to you for a few moments.
So just, I think because of time, and I suspect a few of the questions that may be asked for Diana may be covered in the outbreak control plan and what I'm about to say. So I think you've got in the papers a very comprehensive update from Sandra and Zakia on the outbreak control plan. We have been making some excellent progress around continuing to roll out testing. We've moved the testing centres around slightly in the City of London to make them easier to access and more sustainable long term. So we now have, we've maintained our access to PCR testing and lateral flow testing in the city. And similarly in Hackney, we are continuing to maintain really good, easy access to testing, both for PCR testing as well as lateral flow. And the handing out of lateral flow test kits is going extremely well. And we have integrated that into the vaccination offer, and many people who come forward for vaccination also pick up lateral flow. The message at the moment is still very much locally and nationally, test, test, test. Everybody should be testing at least twice a week. If you're in any way symptomatic with us, the symptoms haven't changed for COVID, then you really must get a PCR test and self-isolate until you get a negative. We have had an increase in outbreaks, quite a significant increase in outbreaks, both in the City of London and also in Hackney. Partly that's because the baseline number of cases in the last 4 to 6 weeks did decrease, but it's now increasing. And because it decreased, there's more ability for us to trace some of the outbreaks. But we are certainly getting outbreaks in hospitality and in workplaces. And often there is poor social distancing that's taking place in those workplaces and other settings, people not wearing masks. And it does bring home the fact that although the vaccination programme is making excellent progress, you do need to have ideally both vaccinations and a couple of weeks after both vaccinations to get that protective effect. And there are still lots of people in London and in City and Hackney who haven't been vaccinated either because of their age or because they haven't come forward yet. So it's really great to see that we're not getting many infections in the older age group, but we still do have people who are vulnerable. And those are the age groups particularly that could lead to the rates of hospitalisation increasing. There are some worrying signs across the country of increase in hospitalisations from COVID. So that is obviously going to be one of the key metrics that we need to be mindful of. And it does take about 4 weeks from when you start to see an increase in COVID circulating. And this is of the Kent variant and particularly of the Delta variant, the form of the Indian variant it's about 4 weeks from when you start to see the big increases before you then see the hospitalisation. So it is too early to have confidence that, as the Daily Mail was announcing today, it's far too early to be clear that actually the vaccination is winning out on that very fine battle. So I think the message at the moment is definitely for the next 2 weeks, it is stick to the current rules of lockdown, work from home when you can, test, keep the amount of people who are meeting in groups absolutely according to the social distancing. And I think across London, we're very much hoping that the national politicians will look at the evidence of the vaccine uptake, where there are some particularly large groups in London who have not yet taken up the vaccine. And we're confident that we will be able to get vaccine uptake. But essentially, if the rules are relaxed as may be laid out in the national plan, that may cause quite significant difficulties over the next few weeks. We do have a small window where we really do need to get that absolute focus on the most vulnerable. And just to address the point that was in the chat around vaccine effectiveness, there are very good trials, data that is coming out from real world trials. So essentially the vaccine is being deployed. You can easily look at, are people who are being hospitalized, have they had both vaccines? Did they have those couple of weeks afterwards to see whether it's effective? And both Pfizer and Moderna and the AstraZeneca are all showing to be effective at actually preventing those hospitalizations. But you do need to have had both vaccines and a period to enable it to have impact. So the other thing just to highlight from the outbreak control plan, we've now got a enhanced self-isolation offer that we can offer in Hackney. So we were successful in getting some additional funds from the Department of Health to implement that. Obviously, that's a really important control measure as well. As soon as people have been are either associated as a contact or potentially a positive, is to make sure that people do self-isolate. And the same with any travel, international travel, is making sure that people absolutely stick to the rules as to how long they have to self-isolate for, and supporting people to do that, but also making sure there is really good compliance. So I think that's really the main highlights I wanted to update. Just in terms of the next 2 weeks, our message absolutely is come forward for vaccination, stick to the current rules on social distancing, mask wearing, and ensuring you're not meeting in groups larger than has been outlined in the national regulations, and then making sure people are testing both twice weekly for asymptomatic, i.e. no symptoms, but as soon as you have any symptoms, you must go forward for a PCR test and self-isolate until you get a negative. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just seeing if there are any other hands up, and that picks up Anna's point that she just made about the importance of the communicating still, the need for distancing, masking, and of course ventilation, the fact that it is so much less transmissible if you're outside or subject to kind of good airflow around you. Okay, got a couple of hands popped up. So I'll take them both together, actually, Rob Chapman and Andrew Carter. So Rob, over to you first.
Thank you. Yeah, could we just go back to the point about testing in schools? I'm looking at page 7 and 8 of Dr. Husband's report, saying there's been a steady decline since the 27th of April. And just registered in the remark earlier that the increase seems to be largely in young people. And could you sort of drill down a bit to see just how concerning this is and sort of what action has been taken to get that testing rate up?
Chris, before you come in, I'll just take Andrew's as well, because we're nearly out of time. Andrew.
Thank you. Mine's very quick as well. It's just in relation, Chris, I know we've had some discussions, but is there more the board can do to help that engagement with businesses and making sure that businesses are actually complying?
Okay, so I'll try to address the testing in schools. I think there's a degree of fatigue around testing, but there's also people are not always registering the tests. So when we can't be 100% sure that certainly the number of tests going out is still encouraging, and is we're making it as easy as possible for people to access tests, from their schools, community pharmacies, libraries, collection centres. So there is good access to the lateral flow test. We don't have a supply issue. I think it's a degree of people not perhaps doing the tests, but then not registering them. And if they don't register them, we don't get to see the uptake. But I think there's also probably a degree of fatigue as well about people testing, and it's really crucial that people do test. So anything that we can do to encourage that message around testing, because as soon as you can find people that have got COVID, then you can help them self-isolate and potentially limit the spread. So I think that's one of those control messages, and you're absolutely right to concentrate on where we are seeing any dips in that lateral flow testing. In terms of businesses, obviously business have had a phenomenally difficult time. It must be incredibly frustrating when you literally have beer in the cellar, customers queuing, summer, sunshine and football to actually comply with those regulations. And I think we have seen in places like Shoreditch and also Soho that the levels of activity are now fairly similar to where they were before the pandemic. A responsible business owner should absolutely be ensuring QR coding, that there is good social distancing, only serving alcohol at tables, etc. And where we are finding people are complying with that, then actually we're not seeing the outbreaks. It's where businesses essentially are not complying with that in hospitality or in the workplaces where they're not having social distancing and they're not putting in mask wearing. And absolutely at the moment, if there is an outbreak, then you will have environmental health and colleagues in public health crawling all over those places in order to try and identify as many of the contacts as possible and self-isolate. And we will, if we have to, put in place closure orders. Most of the premises are reasonable and responsible, but essentially if we don't get on top of this, then you will have that issue that we had before, where the virus very quickly, our rate is already above 1, it's a more transmittable virus already, we will very quickly lose control over the outbreaks. So at the moment we are able to track them down. There is good control compliance. We are not having to issue closure orders in large numbers yet, but I think it's that message of making sure that businesses have absolutely got a significant role for this in the next 2 weeks. We very much hope that there will be a delaying in some of the measures that are in the roadmap, because obviously one of the tests is all about variants of concern and hospitalizations. Too early to know about hospitalizations. Variants of concern we are obviously very clear about. So yes, there is very much a role for businesses in order to make sure that we don't lose control of the outbreaks that we have and the increasing numbers that we're already seeing across London.
Thanks, Chris. So Rob, I assume that's a legacy hand, and I'll therefore give. Yeah, you're not. Yeah, it's gone. So I'll give the last question to Marianne Fredericks, and then I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up this section of the meeting. Marianne.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just following on from the issue of testing and test fatigue. Obviously, this is an important part of our weaponry to keep this under control. Are there any developments to make testing easier coming through? Because I think a lot of people don't find it a very pleasant experience, so we put it that way. And if we can make it much easier and less intrusive, I think people would be happier to take the tests and more testing. So I just wondered if you knew if there's any sort of developments in the pipeline to improve the actual tests themselves, to make them more convenient and pleasant to take, if that's possible. Thank you, Chair.
Mark, do you want me to come back on that? Yep.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're right. It is uncomfortable, unpleasant. I think it does get easier over time. The ideal test would no doubt be a saliva test that was handheld, accuracy of a PCR, results in a few minutes. There are quite a lot of interesting innovations that certainly we get emailed almost on a daily basis, definitely on a weekly basis. In order to go through the regulatory approval process, it does take some time. Department of Health have got a fast track process, and there is then obviously the deployability about it. So you may have some great technology that looks very promising, but you've got to scale it up into the millions. So at the moment, there are, I know, research and procurement, and that is taking place, and as well as slightly lighter touch regulatory approval than for many other testing platforms. But as far as the answer to your question directly, I'm not aware of anything that's coming down very quickly. There has been discussions for some time about moving over to saliva tests for PCR and saliva tests for the lateral flow. But at the moment, it doesn't see, it's not something that I've seen with a definite date. So I think at the moment, as uncomfortable as it may be, it does need to be continue to be that nasal and throat swab in order to get a good and proper accurate result, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and some of the new technologies are considerably more expensive, I understand, as well. So that all has to be factored in. Well, okay, so let's, I think we better finish there. Thanks, everyone. We usually try and have a break between now and the end of the Outbreak Board, and then when we move into the rest of the ICB, I propose that we do that and reconvene at 5 past. And to continue the meeting. So thank you everyone for your contributions and the speakers and some really excellent feedback and papers, and thank you very much. So I'll see you shortly.
Hi, John.
Morning.
Okay. The meeting will reconvene at 10:05.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stella.
Right. Oops. Now just having a quick look to see if all the cameras are just flicking on, which is great. Good. Okay. Well, I think we should reconvene. Welcome. I know some people have now joined us who couldn't make the Outbreak Board part of the meeting. So welcome, everyone. And I know we've got a few attendees as well who will be part of the Integrated Care Partnership Board. So welcome to you too. I know we sort of met several times before on various workshops and things. So I don't propose going around the room, as it were, doing intros. We can see names and introduce ourselves if we are new to the group. That'd be great. Otherwise, I think we should just move on. I should just put a bit of reminder again. We are filmed, and as is usual, and this is posted in the usual places. Just to alert people to that. I appreciate that. We had hoped to be in a position today to sign off the terms of reference, which we spent quite a lot of time poring over last month. And we have got progress on that front. And indeed, we will be, the area subcommittee will be meeting probably one of its few occasions when it meets, in fact, not on its own necessarily, because we're meeting at the end of this meeting to sign off our terms of reference, and members are welcome to sort of stay on the call. We're not joining a different call, so you can continue with us when we do that. We've got a very comprehensive update about all the work that has been going on, so we'll come to that as the meeting goes on. I think some of the practical issues of just actually timetabling all these groups. I know the Neighbourhood Health and Care Board is meeting next month, and they'll be looking at next week, and they'll be looking at the terms of reference for their group. So all being well, we'll be in July in the position to sign everything off and then continue the meeting as our first Integrated Care Partnership Board next time. So there we are. That's kind of the real world, but there's still lots of progress that we can note and well, to some degree celebrate as we continue on our way. So I just want to put that context out there. Alex, do you want to just remind us of the apologies?
None others received, aside from Sunil has sent his apologies for this meeting as well.
Okay, so we know Sandra Husbands and Councillor Antoinette Bramble as well. We noted those before, so Sunil to add to the list. We've got the declarations of interest. Anybody want to note anything different on the register or anything in relation to agenda items today? No. Okay. Can I ask the City ICB to note that and the Hackney ICB to note that, please? Thank you very much. Nods and thumbs.
Noted.
Great. Questions from the public? I haven't received any in advance. I would always try and seek, when there's time, questions from the public as we go through, as you know, always where time permits. Obviously, members and newly invited attendees, I will turn to first. So I shall move on with that to the minutes, previous meeting. Any comments for us there?
Mark, I have a comment. John Williams.
John, yep.
Yeah, can I just refer to 6.7? This doesn't really capture the point I was trying to make in the meeting, and it's kind of, this is a level of frustration for me being expressed now. I mean, I've been saying this for most of the year. I feel now that there's a real misunderstanding of that. The public is supposed to be equal partners in our ambitions here, and this doesn't capture this at all. It doesn't mention the triumvirate that I mentioned either. So I'm really kind of just getting a bit concerned now that I keep repeating myself, that the public aren't properly involved in this, and our ambition is that the public are properly involved in this, not just a thing to be done to. And I'm just kind of frustrated now that I'm not getting this point across, and I'm not quite sure how I can get it across to you, or not you personally, but the board. But I am frustrated that this does not characterise what I said at that meeting.
Okay. Well, with regards to the amending the minutes, do you want to make an amendment and send it through to myself and to Alex? I'll be happy to take that offline. Yeah. In terms of picking up the substance of your challenge, would you be happy for us to pick that up when we do our report of the ICP, etc., how we're developing, and then which Siobhan and Jonathan are presenting, and we can maybe focus in on that then a bit more.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, John. Anne, I've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, just to say I attended the meeting, so could I be added to the list of attendees, please?
Yep, surely. Okay, I've got a couple of hands up. Oh, there are your hands. Marianne, you've got your hand up as well. Marianne Fredericks.
Thank you, Chairman. 6.10, I just wanted to check that Jonathan got my email and he understood the point I was making about the terms of reference to ensure the Chair of Health and Wellbeing was named as one of the members of the new board. I just wanted to check he received it safely. Thank you.
Okay, was that a question for John then, as a matter arising? Did you get that, John?
Yeah, please.
Yes, I've received it, and it's being incorporated into the version of the terms of reference we'll see next month.
Super, that we'll take that as a matter arising then. So any other comments about the minutes, or are we happy? Are we content with them? No. Okay, so John and Marion, you've still got your hands up. Okay, they look like your expressions suggest they're going to come down again. Fine. So can I ask the City ICB to note the minutes, please, and Hackney ICB to note the minutes, please?
Noted.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So going on to the action tracker, I would just bring that up for myself here, which it's now just hiding, of course, because of, there we are. So in terms of the tracker, we've got the first one is in progress, due to come to the ICB in July. The next two I propose to close for the same reason. The third one is closed here, but I think that Siobhan responded to Randall your question as part of the Outbreak board update, hopefully to your satisfaction. So if you're content, we'll close that now, unless I hear from you. Okay, and then the third one, Councillor Chris Kennedy asked for a one-page document could be produced to explain why decisions be taken where decisions are taken in a form that is accessible to the public. I propose that we shut that, Chris. Hopefully you're happy with, on the basis that we've got reference to that as an answer in the papers today, but actually more substantially, there is a guide being developed which is for the public, and Jonathan and Siobhan will maybe mention that in the update we come to later in the agenda. Now that guide is for the public and explains how the system works in a way that will incorporate your question there. I've asked them to bring forward a draft of that guide to the July ICPB, all being well, next month. So I think all of that question there will be incorporated when we see it all collectively next time. So I propose we shut that on the basis of that planning.
Thank you. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. And then the last one I haven't had an update on, so it is in progress, and we'll need to kind of push to get an update on that for the July meeting. So I'm sorry to say that was due today, but we're awaiting an update really. You can read that. It's fairly self-explanatory. So that's the tracker. Anyone else got any comments about that? No, good. Okay, thank you. So if can I ask City ICB to note the tracker, please? Well, actually approve it. I'm sorry, I keep saying noting. We've been approving in our usual way, and the Hackney to approve the tracker as well.
Approved.
Thank you. Great, super. So let's move on to the first substantial item, the Anchor Alliance update, which was postponed from last month. I don't know, Jonathan, if you're going to introduce John Hitchen again. We have a sort of 25 minutes on the agenda for this, so for a sort of 10-minute presentation, then plenty of time for some questions, which we'll be essentially noting and discussing.
Thank you, Mark. I'll be very brief. Obviously, we had a very quick discussion about the issues raised in this presentation last month. John, unfortunately, due to a domestic emergency, was unable to attend, but he's here with us today. So it's an update on the work of the City and Hackney Anchor Collaborative that John's organisation Renacy has been supporting the system with. So he's going to talk a bit about progress to date, and he also has some asks in terms of things that we can do as leaders in the system to support that work going forward. But I'll hand over to John.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone, and just apologies again for last time. I was ankle deep in water when you were meeting last time and sorting out a leak, so apologies for not being there. So I'm not going to share the slides because I know you've got them all in the deck in front of you, and they're quite text heavy, so it's more a format of reporting. I don't think it adds a lot by having them up in front of us. But just to say that we at Renacy, in partnership with particularly the CCG, but then over time the Hackney Council have been kind of having a number of conversations over the last few months about how to move on something around this collaborative. So we kicked it off as an idea way back in the midst of pre-COVID time, as a way to acknowledge that all of the anchor institutions in the patch were doing some quite interesting work in their own domains and on their own terms, as looking about the role that they could take as economic and largely economic actors, and what that could do to sort of advance a wide range of other issues. So how they could think about issues like their estates, their procurement practices, their workforce policies, etc., and how that could support other outcome areas of your work. What we, based on some research from that Julia Slay, who many of you will know, but many of you might not, who's an associate of Renacy's, has done in other countries, particularly North America and Australia, was to think about ways in which anchor collaboratives have brought significant extra advantages to some of the work that many of you are already doing individually as institutions. And so we brought a proposition, and we kind of kicked that off as a what could we do with that collaborative element being at the fore. So not trying to duplicate what you're already doing, because there's plenty of duplication that is always at risk of happening anyway, but really trying to ask the question of, well, what would it look like if 2, 3, 4 anchors worked together on an issue such as procurement, such as workforce? What might that look like, and what could it achieve? So that was the sort of the starting point. We've been through a number of kind of stages of this work, but just to sort of reiterate, even in non-COVID times, there's a large degree of acceptance in the UK and in other countries that to start with, this kind of work can be quite slow, because a lot of it is quite heavy on the relationship building, particularly at middle manager level, of trying to sort of get people who are doing the doing on procurement. I'm going to use procurement as the example as I'm talking, but it applies to other streams of work. The people who are doing the doing are often quite, they've got their own priorities, they're within their own organizational structures. And so building the relationships, looking for shared kind of interests and overlaps of work just takes time. And so for the first sort of 3 to 6 months, we spent quite a lot of time finding the right people, building relationships, and trying to understand what individual organizations were interested in, and where there were some shared ideas around how anchor institutions could collaborate. Obviously, though, because we're looking to work with health and care anchors, the last 15, 18 months has slowed everybody down to do anything that is kind of on top of the day job. So this, part of what we would have hoped to have been a bit further on than we are now, to say the least. But for very understandable reasons, people's time and energies have been taken to the obvious COVID and associated priorities. But what I wanted to bring to you today was just a little bit of an update as to what has been done and where we want to take it, and what it might need from you as institutions to push it forward a little bit more. So in the slide deck, there is a little bit about what it is. There is some definitions about what an anchor organisation is and what an anchor collaborative is, etc., etc. I'm not going to go through all of that. And there were also the initial 4 ambitions for the collaborative that we put forward, which was around facilitating relationships, using data and targeting, pushing innovations, and thinking clearly about accountability. And what I would say is that we have been spending almost all of our time to date on the facilitating relationships. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the implications of that. There is then a slide of some of the initial learning that we got to by the start of COVID. And by that point, there was interest from quite a large number of the anchors in focusing particularly on procurement and workforce. So what could we do collaboratively around procurement, whether that be more on social value or sustainable policies, or around developing kind of joint exercises. That was where we'd got to, and there was also quite a lot of interest in could 2, 3, maybe 4 of the anchors do something collaboratively around some of their workforce policies, particularly around recruitment, particularly about targeting maybe underemployed groups within the borough. How could we think differently about ways in which workforce practice could be done in a collaborative manner across the system? That was where we got to by the start of COVID. Where we are now, which was May 2021 when I wrote this, is that the workforce stream of work, there's been particular interest in a shared apprenticeship scheme for a particular role, and thinking about how a multi-organisational role could exist, and how so initially the conversations were around what might that look at a more entry-level role. But I think to start with, there was interest in the group to explore what that would look like, to sort of test it with a slightly more senior role, see if it could work with some of the practicalities, and then think about what it might look like at a more entry-level role, perhaps, with the idea being that people might move between 2 or 3 anchor institutions and develop practices across the system and learn about, have almost like seats within a legal apprenticeship. I can't think of the right word right now, but and that is still being explored, and there is a decent level of interest in that, and we're quite pleased with the progress that a sort of subgroup of that initial working group around workforce has got to. It is not involving every anchor that we've been talking to. Some, for very good reasons, feel like it doesn't work for them, and I really want to stress that this is the point of the collaboration. We do not want to duplicate, and we do not want to force organisations that collaborative practice might not be right for to collaborate when it's not right for them. The whole point of this is to try and work out what might work for who. So whilst we would want to keep things open for all the different institutions, one stream of work might just be about 2 or 3 doing something together. The hospital and the council, for example, or the CCG and the city might do something together, for example. So that's, we made some good progress on that, and there's a little bit more to do to sort of finalise that with colleagues across the system. And then in terms of procurement, there was kind of 2 routes that have been explored. One was to sort of map out different organisations' pipeline. So what's coming down the track, what sorts of opportunities could it look like if we thought about system-wide. And we found potentially good alignment between a couple of the anchors, the hospital and Hackney Council, around catering procurement contracts, and could we look at how we could work together on that for slightly different reasons, because the council is still thinking about the kind of insourcing, and we've paused that. But I think that that's something that we're going to keep going back to look at. Are there ways in which we could think about working collectively with an ambition of perhaps getting more local suppliers into the procurement supply chain, getting more locally owned businesses, encouraging, so rather than it being a Costa Coffee taking on the concession, is that could, by working together, creating a bit more capacity across those procurement teams, could we think about encouraging local businesses to take things on, consortiums? Could we work together on opportunities? So that's where that direction of travel is, and there's an interest in that. We're just looking for the right opportunity. The other one, which is there's definitely a lot of interest in, and we've already seen some benefits of this in the workshops, is just basically colleagues across the system sharing practice around how they procure and driving up standards around, driving up kind of ideas and standards around thinking of the role of social value in procurement. So it's not necessarily let's work together on catering. It's like, oh, you do that, and people are meeting, and by the kind of process of spending more time together, we're seeing sharing of ideas. That is where we have got to with the two streams that we've been working on to date. You know, as I say, we had in our initial plan, we hoped to have been much further down the line with having data to track these things and some slightly more ambitious ideas, but we're still very much in the, because of COVID, which kind of put particularly about 6 months of everything just stopped, and then you know, for obvious reasons, people have been stop-starting for the rest of the year. We're still in that sort of relationship forming and idea generation phase, but there is a lot of interest and appetite in this, and so I'm just going to finish now with sort of some next steps. We have made tangible progress. We want to make more, but there are two. I think there are two challenges that we have. One is a governance challenge. So you know, there is always the any collaborative, and Renée works on different collaboratives across different places in very, very different sort of issue areas, and the problem is always giving, you need those kind of middle manager doers to be doing the work, but you also need someone more senior to give them the oversight and legitimacy to try different things, to work in a different way that maybe steps slightly outside the usual systems and structures of their home institution, and that it needs both the kind of mid-level buy-in and the senior cover. And we've at times got that right and at other times haven't. And again, a lot of that has been to do with, let's be honest, senior capacity as a result of the last 15, 18 months. But also because it is a new way of working, and sometimes people find it easier when they're resource constrained to revert back to usual ways of working. And so we are exploring, and would be interested in any ideas from you about kind of getting senior leads to give us some for us to have an accountability mechanism to these anchor institutions to kind of hear what the groups are doing in a bit more detail and kind of push us all along. The other thing that I would be interested in that group doing is kind of challenging us to be more ambitious. So I think we've seen around the world examples of these kind of collaboratives can unlock things to be much more ambitious. We're not there yet, partly because it's still quite new, but we're still doing quite, interesting things, but they're not kind of big radical projects at the moment. And I think sometimes having someone a bit more senior to see a broader picture, or to just give the impetus to kind of encourage teams to be more bold, be more ambitious, has been proven useful in other kind of collaboratives that we've looked at and explored. So there has been progress, but there are governance challenges. I will stop there, Mark.
Because I could see that on your slide, the next steps was the last piece. Now I do want to have a bit of time to talk, because there are some hands going up now. So yes, I hope I don't feel I truncated you too much.
You did not. I was just ending then.
Good. Right. So Chris Kennedy, and actually, well, maybe I'll take both together, but let's see Chris's question first.
Brilliant work, John. Really welcome this. A couple of questions about sustainability. Have the anchor institutions been talking to each other about, for example, their net zero targets? The council has a net zero by 2040 target. It looks from certainly the initial work our officers have been doing that our best way of achieving that is by working in partnership with other local authorities, and by implication with other major organisations, and especially given, for example, the amount of single-use plastic that we've had to see use in the last 15 months. Can we work out ways of maybe doing that less? And we've all got with our estates a problem of gas-fired heating, etc., power, when really we'd like to be moving to ground source heat pumps, etc., etc. major challenge for us as the council that we're facing up to, and I'd love to see those conversations going outside the council with other organisations. In terms of your governance question, it feels to me like rather than one-off reporting to any particular board, you need some sort of mechanism and everyone to buy into a working group at senior or intermediate manager level. And that's something I think I would certainly be happy to put to those levels within the council. And then in terms of your reporting back, I wonder, should it be here? And I'm looking at Mark as a co-chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board. This feels like wider determinants of health, and I wonder if actually whatever you set up, the report comes back to the Health and Wellbeing Board and is part of the Health and Wellbeing strategy of Hackney and the Health and Wellbeing strategy of the city, and it comes to that board rather than here. Thanks.
Chris, I mean, I think on the last point before John comes in, whilst he considers picking up the other bits, I agree with you. It does feel wider than health and care, and of course, the Integrated Care Partnership Board will be, essentially managing the health and care elements of the wider strategy. So clearly, where the relevance comes to here, then we can take reports as and when. But I think formally reporting into the Health and Wellbeing, the Health and Wellbeing Board makes sense to me as well. And John, you're nodding. So, do you want to pick up some of the other Chris's points? Obviously, Randall will have views on that, which we'll have to basically discuss outside the meeting. But John, do you want to pick up some of Chris's points, and then Jake, I'll bring you in.
I will. So I'll take them in reverse, given Mark's already addressed the last one. We've been talking particularly to Jonathan, and then on your side, Chris, Stephen Haynes is involved in this, and we're sort of reporting into him. And we've got a sort of a list of people that we have been talking to date at Elft, at the Homerton, at the GP Fed, at the city, who we are kind of going to approach and sort of see if they're willing to take on that sort of role of being a kind of a sponsor almost, and we report to that group of 5 or 6 individuals to sort of get them to give us a bit of oversight, a bit of a kick sometimes. So we've got a list, but I really wanted to sort of raise this here so others could hear it, because I think it's exactly what this needs, for all the reasons that you described. And then in terms of your first point, we have been talking to and working with Bryony Peat, who many of you might have come across, who's working particularly with the CCG and her work that she's doing through Circular Life. She has been talking to many parties about some of the issues that you raise. And so one of the things we're thinking about is there appetite for us to work together a little bit more? So I'll take your point away and talk to Bryony again and see where they're up to and see if there are things that we can do to kind of push it on. But it's definitely on the radar of other kind of connected projects and areas of work.
Great. Jake.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, John. I think we last spoke about this a year and a half ago, John, so it does feel like it's gone into a bit of a vacuum, but you've explained why. Couple of questions and comments. I think it's a great opportunity to do things differently and to do things collaboratively. Given the massive increase in youth unemployment, and it'll only get worse before it gets better, and particularly amongst young black people, I'm interested in your views as to how this can help with that, and particularly about how we can ensure there is a easy journey for people to go on to get ready for those jobs, because often we need to do a lot of pre-employment work rather than just necessarily say, here are the jobs, off you go, guys. So that's my first point. Second point is, do you see there being a role specifically for the VCS as a significant employer in the borough? I mean, we've estimated that between 5,000 and 6,000 people are employed in the voluntary sector in City and Hackney. And then my last point was about social value, because I think I raised it at the last meeting when you were unable to attend, but the council is working with an organisation to look at how during major procurement exercises social value can be realised, which can inject cash and pro bono stroke volunteering support from businesses who win contracts, so that they, at the point of competing for a contract or a tender, they say, well, we'll offer this on top of what we're offering the council in terms of the specification. I can see Chris nodding. This is a really exciting piece of work, and it potentially could realise real substantial new monies for the borough to focus on tackling inequality. And I think I'm happy to introduce you to the guy that's leading on it from the Social Value Exchange, and he's talking with various people in the council's procurement department. I've got a chat with him tomorrow morning, so I could raise this and then make that linkage for you.
Thank you, Jake. And yes, it does feel like things have got stuck since we last spoke. I mean, some of the relational stuff has definitely moved on, but I think substantially, your point is correct. I'll take your points in reverse, if that's all right. So I'd absolutely love to be connected to the colleague from Social Value Exchange. We've come across some of their work in other things that we do. So yeah, that would be a really helpful connection. Thank you for that. I would also, so based on other examples of this, you know, one of the risks of anchor collaboratives at a time when all of us are interested in ways in which we can involve and engage communities and lived experience much more, is that it can veer a little bit into the sort of institutional conversations, because it's kind of, you know, who are the big organizations and how do they work with each other, and you can sort of get a lot of your time absorbed in that kind of conversations between large organizations and stray away from smaller community organizations or the community itself. So I would be really interested in how we can do that, but I don't have an idea based on previous examples of how to do it neatly. And I know you're a busy man, Jake, but I would appreciate, you know, if you had some time, perhaps we could catch up to see if there are ways in which we could think about how to more effectively work with the VCS. Because, you know, all of the other institutions we've been working with are, you know, are single organisations with large either procurement budgets or employment footprints themselves in the patch. But we would very much value that if we could find a good way to do it. So I'll follow up with you after this meeting to see if we can set up some time. And then your first point, I think this is part of that kind of next step for this work of what's the next level to push it on. We've been having some good conversations about these two themes, but we know from other places that it's most effective when you're quite precise about how you want to channel these energies. So we know in other countries and other examples that we've looked at, where, you know, classic examples in the US are working with unemployed black men, particularly coming out of the criminal justice system. You know, anchors have worked together to say, we want to do something about that. It's not that there aren't other problems in our area of benefit. It's not that we're uninterested in other things in our own delivery, but for the collaborative, we want to try and channel those energies towards a problem that we all agree needs extra energy. And so I would, you know, we need that energy to come from the anchors to say that they want to, you know, and we're constantly looking for things. But your point about unemployed, particularly young black men, is the one that has come up a few times from different anchors and different organisations, and it is the one that we're kind of nudging towards. But I think so I would be really excited if we could start to sort of pick something of, you know, if we're going to collaborate around our workforce, we want it to, you know, we're going to try and design it. I'm going to cut in now.
Sorry to have to.
No.
The time is we're running over time now.
Sorry.
But no, it strikes me that the next steps, you know, we're sort of feel like almost like a threshold now. The sort of hopefully, notwithstanding the challenges of COVID that lie ahead, we can move more on here, and it feels like that. Sort of reviewing some of the governance that sits around this and the resources to support it and the endorsement that's required at a senior level the detail needs to be worked on outside obviously the meeting, but clearly bringing it to the attention of today to us all is really, you know, the focus of the work. A lot of us are aware of elements of it, but I think it's really helpful that we shared a collective discussion, and that and hopefully you'll see some traction in terms of moving forward into the future. I proposed next steps in any detail we'll just have to take out of the meeting, really. We can't hope to cover that off adequately here. Is that all right? Hopefully you've got what you hoped to get from the meeting today. Thank you for coming and presenting. I'll take your nods as happily ready to move on. I've also just seen 2 more hands go up. Is that in relation to this particular item? Siobhan and Andrew?
Yeah, mine was, Mark. Yeah, I mean,
quick,
it was
I'm
really in
afraid.
the context of next steps. So just, I mean, you sort of indicated, yes, let's take it outside, and I would agree. But I think what I've heard from a sort of mandate point of view, I guess, is what is good to hear in terms of that relationship with the health and wellbeing boards and that kind of overall. And I think we just need to pick that up with more conversation with you, John, and with Jonathan's involvement as well, because I think it's and I really value your kind of summary around needing to be quite specific, because I think this is right in terms of these programs become so overwhelming. It's similar with the sustainability piece and Bryony's work, that you kind of get lost in all the opportunities, but actually doing something really concrete, I think, would be helpful. And I think we can take that forward. I'm happy to make sure that happens.
Great, thanks, Siobhan. And I guess I didn't reiterate the fact that we're hugely supportive of this work, because we've said that before. But actually, of course, it bears saying again and endorsing the work, and I think we would all want to support it in ways we can. Andrew.
I'll be very quick. I think the only thing for me, and I understand the point regarding the health and wellbeing boards, but almost how are we going to get that whole system approach? Because again, it does sound like there's lots happening in the council, there's lots happening in some anchor organisations, there's bits that are going on in other. I'm not sure we're actually harnessing the whole system, and the health and wellbeing boards again takes us out into City, Hackney. Where are the big cross-cutting things that only we can move as a whole system? I know we've got to get there, but that should be our ambition.
Sure, no, absolutely agree with that. So, Jake, still got your hand up. I think it's probably legacy. Yeah, okay. So can I ask I mean, it's almost like I'd like to, re-endorse this work, but actually we're only asked to note it, but I think we should note for the minutes that we certainly collectively endorse this work. But just for the sake of the proper process, can I ask the City ICB to note the report and Hackney ICB to note the report, please?
Noted.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's great. Okay. Thank you very much. So let's move on to we have a brief item on the PCN progress and tackling health inequalities. Jenny Daquan, I saw you joined, Jenny, the call on the PCNs. We've had the paper. Obviously, it describes many of the activities that are happening. I don't know if you want to give a couple of minutes just to sort of highlight some of that work, and we can have a bit of time for questions. But it's really, I guess, just for this piece fell out of an action, I think, that where members wanted to be a little bit more cited on some of this work that the PCNs were leading on. So thank you for letting us know where you've got up to. So do you want over to you for a few highlights, then we'll take some questions. I hope you're still on the call, Jenny.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, board. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk to you about some of the work that we are looking at in terms of inequalities. I wanted to start by saying actually the spec for inequalities hasn't actually been released, and so we're waiting for that to be released sometime next year. But from the document that I kind of have given in today, you could see that like most of the networks are looking at areas that kind of represent areas of inequalities for that network. But I thought I'd focus on my network because obviously I'm kind of very much more au fait about exactly what's been going on there. So the way that we approached it in Shoreditch Park and City PCN was we wanted to get patient involvement quite early on. We did a piece led by Dr. Suki Francis, who's my clinical lead, on looking at patient engagement. So there was lots of leaflets, surveys, questions, and from that we were able to form focus groups. It's still in process. It hasn't been completed yet, but it's been a good way to kind of work out what the problems are, where the inequalities are from the patient's perspective. And some of the ideas that have come up from that is one, the childhood obesity. I mean, that was number one in our network, and we were quite surprised by that. We thought perhaps it would be something much more different. And so since then, what we've done is we've tried to kind of liaise with Home Matern and the childhood services, and we're trying to kind of put together some sort of childhood package that not only looks at diet, but actually looks at the child as a whole. So that is a big piece of work that we're kind of looking at. Another thing that came out of looking at some of this work was the isolated males. So these are a group of men who perhaps don't access services, perhaps need services, but actually will sit at home and not really attend. So the idea is to use some of our additional roles, such as social prescribers, to set up a group for isolated males, one, to have a sort of outreach to them, but also to have a way of them contacting us and receiving services and perhaps education around their health needs. During the pandemic, we knew that smears would be a problem. Any kind of screening always goes to the wayside. So things like smears, childhood IMS would always be a casualty. And so what we did within our network was we set up an extended access smear group, smear clinics, which is across all the practices in the network across the week, and including weekends, and encouraged women from any of the practices to attend any of the clinics to try and maintain some of the levels of smears that we would normally do. And it's been extremely successful. Women have liked it because it's allowed them to come into clinic when perhaps they wouldn't be able to if they were looking after the children, particularly over the kind of the pandemic, when a lot of women were at home with the children, or lots of families were at home with the children. Looking in terms of the actual COVID vaccination, we're looking at setting up a hesitancy project that's going to be led by Sam Michael, where she's doing a research project looking into where is the hesitancies. We've looked a lot at patient hesitancies, but also there was perhaps some hesitancies in our staff, and as they're the first point of contact, who will, if they're hesitant, how can we really, encourage them to encourage patients to actually have the vaccines. And there's also an outreach project that's currently underway from some monies in liaison with neighbourhoods. So, I mean, that's just a brief kind of run through some of the areas that we've been looking at. And there are other areas that other networks are looking at in detail. But I'll stop there just for questions.
Well, Jenny, thank you. And it gives a really good flavour of the work, actually, and actually how it's, it's at a relatively early stage. And as you say, there'll be more sort of formality around it with the PCN directions coming out, as you alluded to, next year, etc., etc. But also how it fits with the general work that's going on all across the ICP, which is always interesting to know how things do come together and for the greater collective good. So I've got a hand up. Anne, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question? There's a couple of nice comments also in the chat, which people may want to actually verbalise.
Thanks, Mark. I just wondered how the work's being coordinated across the different PCNs to ensure that there's learning happening from each other and to avoid duplication. For example, screening seems to pop up in several, and what are the plans to sort of try and join that up as much as possible?
Can I take Jake's question as well, Jenny, before you make a note of plans? And then Jake, do you want to come in as well?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Jenny, for that overview. I'm not sure if you were part of the outbreak control conversation we had this morning, but many on the call were talking about how we build on the learning of engaging communities through the pandemic and how that could foster stronger relationships of trust and whatnot with communities. And I think it'd be really interesting to get your perspectives from PCN viewpoint about how you can, as PCNs, work with the voluntary sector to help that, because I think we'd be really keen to both use the neighbourhood programme and the COVID grants and community champions to say to PCNs, look, if you want to focus on any health issue, use this community infrastructure to help build those longer term relationships. So you know, some real potential there. And as you know, Jenny, we've got our session on the VCS Assembly next Tuesday talking about emotional well-being, and I think that for me is a massive priority for voluntary sector and public sector colleagues. So I know you didn't really touch on mental health so much, but I think that is going to be the growing big issue, big ticket issue for all of us over the next 12 months.
Jenny, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jake. So I'll answer Anne's question first. So what usually would happen is that we have a CD board. So the clinical directors meet once a month, and at that meeting, any kind of initiatives, pilots, ideas are discussed with all members of the clinical directorship, and any learning is usually brought to that forum. And so if one of the clinical directors decided that they wanted to, for instance, do a catch-up smear program, then the SOP and all the work that has gone into it to do that pilot would just be handed over to that neighbourhood, so that or that network, so that they could just follow that SOP accordingly. So I think the thing with the PCN work is that the idea is that you're looking at your local population. So for some of us as networks, we have a huge problem with smears, but I think there are some networks that perhaps are on top of it, so they would perhaps look at something different. So, but we do share the learning because we do think that's important, and anything that can be done across the whole 8 networks, then we do all of it together. In terms, Jake, thank you for your question, and I totally agree with you. I think when it comes to looking at patient engagement, I think it's really important that we're involved in the voluntary sector, and because I think that they are a big force for patients. Then they hold a lot of information about patients that we perhaps don't hold as GPs. When we tried to do our patient engagement work, we tried as much as possible to involve the voluntary sector, so we used Health Watch, etc. But I know that we can go further, so would welcome any kind of liaisons and any kind of offer of supporting us as PCNs, because that's exactly what we're looking for.
Excellent, thanks, Jenny. And I guess also just it cheers me enormously that this is yet again another key part of neighbourhood working. And actually, and here we are thinking about how we pull all the bits together across the neighbourhood, and then where it makes sense to pull it across the whole of City and Hackney and further afield if required. But it's just that emphasis on that key unit of the neighbourhood, and I'm sure we'll hear more on the update about what's happening in that space. So I'm slightly filling in. I can't see any more hands or questions in the chat. I think, Jenny, it's really helpful and informative to give a kind of that sense of the flavour of what's going on. So, and I think people are really welcoming it, and would in the fullness of time want to hear more and see how it fits together with the various other things that are going on within neighbourhoods, etc. Thank you very much. So can I just for process ask the City ICB to note that report, please, and the Hackney ICB to note it too.
Noted.
Thank you very much, everyone. So let's move on. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan and I think Siobhan to talk about the transition governance progress update. I should just say, in terms of managing the agenda, we have got until 12, but the meeting will end before that to give time for the area subcommittee to sign off its tour. So I am minded that of that anyway, but we've got plenty of time for this item, so over to you to present the highlights, and then we'll discuss it.
Okay, shall I kick off then, Jonathan? And so thank you all very much, and this is an update that we're bringing today on the development of the ICP, the Integrated Care Partnership, and the operating model locally that we've been working on really since April. I guess that I sort of keep using the phrase cart before horse, because there are elements of what we've been doing that are slightly out of order, because everything is slightly out of order at the moment, and so this is an attempt to try to give the overall picture, but recognising, I think, probably that there are some parts, and I suppose thinking particularly about some of John's comments earlier on today about that maybe feel more developed than others, and that's acknowledged and understood. And you know, I guess what we wanted to show today really was that we are generally making a lot of progress, and I feel have done a lot of really good work in quite a short period of time. The pack itself kind of focuses really on the kind of governance structures around setting up the integrated care partnership. It also focuses on some initial work we've done in terms of thinking around the moving from our very familiar work streams that we're all quite you know, au fait with, into thinking about what our new improvement programs will look like and what they will cover and how they will be developed, and then some specific actions around that work that we will be doing as partners, and then also it also summarises a lot of the priorities that we have put together in respect of recovering, particularly from the pandemic, and thinking ahead into 21-22 in line with some of the must-do requirements from the NHS and other key priorities locally. But again, I suppose some of that might feel like it's slightly out of order because there are some things that we haven't had the chance to do yet, but are scheduled to be done. So that's what I really wanted to say that on the offset. In terms of the work that we've done around the governance, I guess really the key groups, the key parts of the operating model. So this group is obviously a very key one. You heard from Mark earlier that we're signing off our area committee terms of reference today, which gives us that formal delegation from North East London into our local system. So that's a move forward, and that really gives us the kind of level of autonomy as a local system that was described earlier on in the year. The Neighbourhood Health and Care Board meets next week. The People and Place Committee, which I guess is going to be a central role in terms of bringing forward the voice of residents and patients and the wider community to this group, has the second of its development sessions today, where it's kind of formulating what its identity and its purpose is, and I really hope that will be a very rich source of information that will feed into this group on a regular basis in terms of keeping us in touch with what's going on out in the patch. The Quality and Outcomes Group has met twice. There are issues that are being managed in terms of statutory responsibilities that still need to be delivered at a local level from an quality assurance perspective that we will need to keep hold of, and for the remainder of the year in terms of the life of the CCG, and then I've forgotten now what the other group is. Finance and performance. That's it. That's established, and that has started to meet quite regularly, with a system finance group being developed alongside that. I guess the key thing for us is that we recognise that NEL CCG has got potentially quite a short lifespan, as you know, like the developments around the integrated care systems nationally has been, and the timetable around the white paper, etc. That kind of superseded some of our original thinking, and now that ICS development is also running concurrent with the work that we're doing locally, with a time frame for shadow form of the ICS by October, with a view to implementation in April next year, which obviously seems really ambitious, but is another sort of way in which we need to pivot as a system in terms of how we relate to that development and the development of provider collaboratives, which will be happening alongside the work that we're doing locally. So we have got, as a system, we need to think about how we build our teams and we build our integration at this place-based level, but also being mindful of what's going on that bigger North East London footprint. So it's quite a lot to think about from a kind of governance and structural point of view. I think the key things I wanted to draw attention to really were around the work stream work. You'll see that in your pack. There's a kind of trying to map what existing work streams cover and how the new programs of work will be picking up all of the things that we need to do locally. And I guess the next phase that we want to undertake is real development of that with partners and with our residents and with the public around the kind of system ownership of that, and really feeling like it belongs to us all, and it's not something that's sort of superimposed from a particular group, rather than it being something that everybody owns. And that's the bit again about the cart and the horse, where we haven't had the capacity really to do that level of work and that level of planning with people. And alongside that, I think we are quite keen to look at revisiting some of our strategic objectives that were set out, and some of our revisit our outcomes framework and some of our with the lens of the impact of the pandemic and what that's really brought to the fore, and looking at that again around the September time. So that's work that needs to happen, but is being planned and is in process. I think just really to just flag really that it's a complex picture around the relationship between all of the players locally, and making sure that people feel that they're participating, and that we can keep involved from a North East London perspective as well, and that we're understanding how things are all going to shape up over the coming months. But this is just really gives you that update, and I think Jonathan's going to just add some specifics around the relationships with health and wellbeing boards and some of the planning work that we're thinking about around that as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. So on page 42 of the pack, there is a slide that sets out a sort of an initial attempt at describing what the key boards in the system do, because there's been a lot of concern about duplication of effort. Earlier today we talked about anchor work, and there was a sense that may be a piece of work that sits better at the health and wellbeing boards rather than at this board. So what I also had a really useful discussion with Sandra last week, and she had said that she found it slightly frustrating that when we presented the system, the health and wellbeing boards were kind of sort of at one level removed. They were sort of joined into the diagram, but she felt it didn't represent the health and wellbeing board's work and their strategy for the local system effectively. And the way she described it, which I think makes a lot of sense, is almost more like a Venn diagram, where the health and wellbeing strategies cover all aspects of improving the health and wellbeing of local people and reducing health inequalities. So big focus on the wider determinants as well as the delivery of health and care. And that within that is the work of the Integrated Care Partnership Board. So the health and wellbeing boards are high level and strategic around improving health and reducing inequalities, and the Integrated Care Partnership Board develops the health and care component of that. And that should mean that in terms of the work of the Health and Wellbeing Board in developing strategy and checking progress, it should really be focusing in those meetings on non-health and social care aspects, and the Integrated Care Partnership Board provides that accountability and oversight of delivery against the health and care strategy. And I think in other parts of the country there could be an anxiety around that, because there isn't the representation of democratic representatives, so elected members wouldn't necessarily be on something the equivalent of an Integrated Care Partnership Board in most parts of the country. But because we have significant elected member representation on ICPB, I think that fear that the health and care components wouldn't have the same accountability to local people and the same level of democratic oversight, I don't think that arises in our system. It then tries to set out the distinction between the Integrated Care Partnership Board and the Neighbourhood Health and Care Board. So we've often talked in the past about the what and the how. So the Integrated Care Partnership Board setting out what it wants to achieve in health and care, and perhaps through a regular mandate between the two boards, and the Neighbourhood Health and Care Board, which is more operational and has representation of the senior leadership of all the organisations in the system. It thinks about how you deliver that strategy and how you achieve those outcomes. The area committee, obviously it's agreeing its terms of reference at the end of the meeting today. It its role is, and as Siobhan said, this is a sort of temporary thing whilst ICSs are set up, but its role is really the mechanism through which resources and responsibilities are delegated to the city and Hackney level. So the vast majority of its functions will be discharged as part of ICPB. There's a small number of reserve functions that can only be discharged by the area committee, but again, it would those decisions would be made by area committee members only, but within the context of the broader group. And then finally, it talks about the integrated commissioning boards. So many of the original functions, which were very broad, of our integrated commissioning boards are now carried out by the wider ICPB. So in terms of decisions that would only be taken by ICB members in future, that's likely to really only be around pooled funding arrangements. And again, those decisions, whilst being taken only by ICB members, would be taken in the context of the broader group. And when we were looking at the matters arising, we talked about Chris's request for, how we describe the system on a page, and so we wanted to sort of run this initial view with the board, and then if people are happy with this in broad terms, then we would use this as the basis for something probably in slightly simpler language that would go into the guide. And I'm very conscious that this doesn't include subcommittees, and in particular, it doesn't include the people in place group, which I think would need to be a really solid explanation of how that works in the guide, because that's clearly one of the subgroups that's going to be more important to local people than perhaps some of the more technical ones. But I will leave it at that, and Sean and I will take questions.
Yeah, I mean, I just to reiterate that last point, really, I guess it's, there is a complex picture, and trying to, reflect that in a public facing guide, it would be helpful to get that steer, really, I think, in terms of particularly perhaps from John and Anne around some of the thoughts that might be about how the public can access this machinery, really, as well. That would be helpful.
Yeah, and that brings in, John, your challenge from you, which you brought up when you commented about the minutes of last time. Before I bring Chris, Kelly, and Jake in, John, did you want to pick up anything in that regard to in response to your challenge earlier?
So yeah, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Siobhan and Jonathan, and particularly Siobhan, thank you for your introduction, which kind of explained well about how things kind of move at different speeds within this structure. I do appreciate that. I think in terms of kind of just in terms of the slide pack, it's kind of it'll be useful maybe on slide 3 refers to the Tracy and Siobhan roadshow that's going to be going on for senior management teams. I think that's a really good idea. I think it'd be really helpful if the people in place get included in that roadshow, because I think that'd be a good way of actually kind of getting into the conversation with the residents that way. And also on the slide 4, the proposed partnership values. I think these are quite system based, and I can understand why they are, but I do think the triumvirate of the resident, the practitioner, clinician, and the manager should really be in there as well, as demonstrating that kind of strong commitment that the public are really want the public involved in this process. In terms of kind of making sure you have a kind of a coherent and easy to read document about this, which is I have to say is a real challenge, because you kind of want to say everything, but also say it in a way that's understandable to people. I do think that probably needs to be developed with the people in place group, and also the communications and engagement enabler group, because I think this is a really important opportunity to actually kind of get out there and actually talk about what we're trying to achieve here. And there's a video being produced at the moment for residents around the neighbourhoods, which I think will be very helpful about launching the neighbourhoods more effectively to the residents. And that should be linked into the way the guide is developed as well, because I think that process will help really develop a kind of a much clearer, straightforward way of actually explaining what's going on, and not overwhelm people or make them feel like this is a thing that they can't get involved in, because I think that's, and I do think that's a challenge to kind of have to encourage people to get involved in what we're doing here. But I think it's the challenge that we have to take up, because if we really want to see the transformation on the ground, getting the public involved when they're feeling exhausted, disempowered, and not involved is I think one of the most important things that we have to achieve. So I'll be more than happy to kind of work with you on this.
Thank you, John. I'm going to leave that as some feedback, really, and comments, and take some questions.
That's extremely helpful, and thank you, John. Very helpful.
Yeah, indeed. So I've got Jake Ferguson first, Jake, and then Chris Kennedy. So Jake.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Siobhan and Jonathan. Couple of things. We first saw the sort of priorities for the partnership, I think, were aired by David as he left at the sort of development session a few months ago. And I think when I sort of read these, I see them still quite clinically. And I'm just wondering whether, as a partnership, we need to revisit our priorities or the particular headings and the detail under those priorities, because, you know, things are changing rapidly. We know that people are getting more anxious around their mental health, for instance, and how is that reflected in here? The other thing was about on page, where is it? Page 15, where you've got the voluntary and community sector. It's really good to see that us having a specific focus. It's fantastic. I think I would add to that list the need to really understand the current level of resources going into voluntary and community sector. We often talk at this partnership about the need to work more with the community, and especially in the context of the learning of how we've all responded together to the pandemic, the bigger focus on inequality. The voluntary sector are a key way that we can address some of those big relational issues and around trust, confidence, information, access, and so on. So it would be really good at some point, I know we've sort of touched on this before, Siobhan, but a specific piece of work that across all the partners, we understand the profile of investment going into the voluntary sector. And I remember our original plans way back in devolution days was that we wanted to see a shift of more money going into prevention, because that ultimately saves the whole system money in the longer term. But I feel that we've lost that as a sort of principle. And I think that will be critical if we want to do things differently in the future, that we really see that shift from, you know, clinical services only being for those that really need it, but communities being empowered to help themselves wherever possible, because that saves the system money. I'm ranting a bit, but you know.
Thanks. I think we get the picture. No, thank you. Yeah, interesting series of challenges. I'm going to take Chris Kennedy's comment next, and then and your hands up too. So maybe we'll just take all three, and then you can think about responding, Siobhan and Jonathan. So Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to do a general point and a specific question. Jake has sort of done my general point better than I could have done, because I was going to talk about prevention and about that we were talking about the message we want to get out and share with people what we are about, and actually at the very simplest level, neighbourhoods and delivering services as close to people as possible is about prevention, and it's about letting people understand that going to the gardening club or doing an exercise in the park with some people on a regular basis actually is good for all aspects of individuals' lives, and in the long term, us as a system get saved a whole lot of money if people are just slightly more active every day and just slightly more connected to the places where they live, and getting the simplicity of that at the same time as letting people understand as much as they want to the complexity of that slide, which I think is nearly there, just needs to fill in about how and where people can interact and influence the system. Sorry, that was my general point. My specific question was, what decisions exactly is it, which discrete decisions will only rest with the area committee that it will then take? I don't understand specifically what those are.
Which is quite a lot there. Before I bring, excuse me, Anne in, we've got some other hands up as well. Do you want to respond to those first two comments, questions?
Me? Yeah, sure. So I guess I think it's a fair challenge in terms of the prevention narrative and role of the volunteer. And I did talk with Sandra about this, Jake, as well, actually. So and I think it actually is where we need to take that conversation further around the work that we do collectively as the two partnership, or the three partnerships really, how we galvanise the whole system, as Andrew mentioned earlier, because a lot of the things that Chris has just examples that Chris has given, are totally important and fundamental, but whose business they are and how we get them done across the system is really important. And I don't think it's just the health and care partnership that will be able to deliver that piece. So I think it is about how we do it with voluntary sector, with communities, with people themselves, but it's really how we use the assets of the whole system to make that happen. And I don't have the answers to that yet, but I absolutely agree that it's important and that's work that we need to do. And I guess it is, this document does reflect priorities that are quite focused and within a framework that's quite targeted around, from an NHS perspective anyway, particularly, it's all about vaccinations and recovery from, the elective recovery at the moment. So, the blinkers are quite on, in that sense. So I can understand why it might feel like that from the outside perspective. And maybe Tracy might like to say something more about the SOC priorities that we've pulled together for the system too. The terms of reference, I don't know if Jonathan was going to pick that question. Yeah. So in terms of the actual decisions that get made by the area committee, and I think that was all I was going to say in response. But Jonathan, did you want to ask about answer about the terms of reference?
Yeah. So there, in the terms of reference for ICPB that we've looked at before, it included the area committee terms of reference, and at the end of that there is a list of reserved functions. So it is, I could read them out to you or I could send them to you, but it's about 15 things, and we still have a CCG even though it's at a North East London level, and just that the law states that these are things that are CCG reserved decisions. So there's not a lot we can do about that. So it says approving commissioning plans, approving demographic service use and workforce modelling. So it's a whole range of things that the decision formally needs to be taken by the area committee. But I think we've always been clear that the decision will be taken within the wider group, and the lawyers have advised us before that depending on the nature of the decision, I think particularly around procurement decisions, we might need to take some advice and take some care about the discussion around it. But we're very clear that we want the discussion to be the broader group, but the decision formally to be taken by the area committee members. So I think there would be a very, very small number of occasions where there would be a need for people to leave the room and that sort of thing. So I think other than the way the minutes record decision making, it shouldn't feel like that was a different group of people making a decision without hearing the views of wider parts of the system. But I'll send you the specific section. I'll send it round.
One thing I'd say about it, unfortunately, Henry Black is on leave this week. Otherwise, he would have been here, and Steve Collins was deputising for him and has had to leave the meeting, because then we would have got the perspective actually from talking to colleagues at NEL. This is all as agreed as how local systems, in our case the ICP, should function really, because that's it comes back to the whole system won't thrive unless the local's thriving and is enabled to thrive. So that's kind of the narrative that I keep, well, personally and others we keep discussing at a North East London level. So yeah, there's no surprises to anyone else across the system the way we've set this up. Shall I bring in Anne next, and then Laura Sharp, and then probably we ought to move on to the last item on the agenda. Anne.
Thanks, Mark. I found this a really helpful document. Thank you. You've done an amazing job to bring together this complex picture in one very clear document. So thank you. I have a specific question about subcommittees. So on page, that relates to page 43 of the pack. And I was just wondering if, for consistency, should the people and place group not also be a subcommittee like those that we have for finance and performance and for quality, given that there are also statutory duties related to patient and public involvement? And I suppose I worry slightly that it looks as though the people and place group may carry slightly less weight by not being.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, Anne. And I think, to be honest with you, I think some of that is probably because we're slightly waiting for you to finish doing the development and being very clear about your remit and your role and owning those responsibilities, because you're quite right, there still remain statutory duties of us as a system on behalf of North East London CCG. So if that's where we end up from today's conversation, I think that would be fine.
Okay. Great, thanks.
Muted myself whilst coughing. Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. I'd just like to echo, this is really coming along. I'm starting to get my head around this now, so thank you to Jonathan and Siobhan. I want us to just return to the comment that Jake made, because it really resonated with me about how since devolution days, we have been talking in various high leadership settings about the inequalities and prevention brief and how it should drive everything that we do. And I wonder, not for today, but what the views of this group are about whether we try and make that a bit more real as we start this new programme, so that it starts to shift from something we talk a lot about into something we measure year on year, that we set ourselves some tests at ICPB level about levels of investment and shift of resource, because otherwise we're not able to say that we're actually making it real. And I'm not sure, it may be true since devolution conversations and now that we've already done some of that, but I have no measure about it. So maybe maybe we should learn from that and think about what the test would be 12 months from now, and meld that into our terms of reference. Because and I completely understand why it's quite vague in the current planning document for the year that we're in now, because we're in recovery. But there'll always be a reason why inequalities in prevention and shift in investment is of a lesser order, as it were. And I think I've heard us here say we want it to be of the top order. So it seems to me we've got to challenge ourselves a bit more on this. So I'm wondering whether we should start with if we're going to have the first ICPB in July, start with a paper that says this is our baseline, this is where we're beginning, this is what our definitions look like for investment in inequalities and preventative work that is under the brief of this board and this system that we oversee. And then we can come back to that through the year to see what's happening and whether that is changing up, down or not, and where that resource is. It's just a way. Yeah, absolutely, Honor. We have got to agree what the definition is. But it seems to me that if we don't do that, how are we going to know we've done it? And how we're going to know if we're doing it at the speed and the rate that we want to do it, if we all agree that this is probably the major health and care impact that we can make for our residents.
Shall I come back on that, Mark?
Yeah, yes.
So I think I agree, Laura. It would be very good to do that. And I know certainly, I think Anna's gone now, but Anna Garner and we have talked about that in the context of the Population Health Hub, the whole health inequalities programme of work that's being led by the steering group, and that conversation piece that we talked about with Sandra and the public health team. My gut instincts is that July might be a bit early, and I think it does link to that conversation about refreshing and revisiting and restating our strategic objectives and what the outcomes that we want to address. But I think they're all connected, and so I would completely agree that we can do something on that. I think it just might be a bit soon to do it in July, but I'm very happy to make sure that comes back.
Yeah, I think that whole piece feeds into our sort of review of the outcomes framework. You know, how do we know?
Yeah, exactly.
And I know that the pace of that review has been affected by people being pulled into other work related to the COVID pandemic and recovery and things. But it is happening. It's just a slower rate of progress than we'd like. And I think July, I agree, is probably a bit early to land it. But it's certainly something we all would want to see in the near future. Okay, so I've got another hand up. Whose hand was that? I'm just. Oh, it's yours, Laura. So just there's lots of chat going in the conversation. I don't know if anyone wants to articulate any of those. Other suggestions? John, you've put in things about the coordination services for people that have chronic conditions and support for your position there, Laura, from Chris. Okay, any opportunities anybody wants to verbalise any of those? I'm happy to take, there's a moment to take non-members verbalising things if they want to. Articulate any of those comments in the chat out loud. I like your idea of the thematic idea as well, Anna. That's all really helpful stuff to think about. Okay, so I think probably with time ticking on, we probably ought to move on to the risk, the BAF. So just to finish off this piece, can I ask the City ICB to note that report and Hackney ICB to note their report?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Siobhan. Thank you, Jonathan. That's great. So just quickly, we've got a truncated risk register today. Matt, did you want to just highlight any comments? I know there's not been much movement, which you summarised in your covering paper, and then we'll take any questions on that.
Of course. Thanks, Mark. Yes, so we've got summary risks this month escalated from our work streams. Covers only red rated risks either initially or this month. Just to clarify one thing on the cover sheet, does state that there were some new risks in here. That is not the case. Apologies, that was a typo there. So there are no new risks. We've had a little bit of an update on CYPMF 17 regarding community paediatrics workforce at the Homerton, and we are picking up John's points around CAM's capacity, and we'll get a paper around before the next meeting on that one from the team. I'm happy to take any questions. We are continuing to look at risk management over the summer and in the next month for how we bring reports here in the future.
That'll be welcome, because obviously even just the reference to the work streams is, plank out and plank out, just making sure it's all aligned with the new ways of working within the ICP. But I appreciate that's a big, piece of work, but it's will be welcome when we see that. Any other? Yeah. Okay. Good. No other hands up. Some general comments going in the chat, but I'm looking forward to the CAMS paper indeed. Yes, indeed. So with that, I think we should probably move on. So City ICB, can they note the modified risk register this month, please? And Hackney ICB also note it, please.
Noted.
Noted.
Thank you very much. The escalated risks, I should call it. So that brings us on to AOB. Have we got any? I haven't been notified of any. Matt, you popped your hand up, so have you got one?
I do actually, Mark. Just very briefly, just to give people a heads up, there is work underway to launch a stadium vaccination event in the North East London area in the next week or so. If people could keep an eye on Twitter feeds and social media, and any help in promoting and passing on information about that in the next 48 hours or so would be very much appreciated.
Okay, actually, there is a date. It's the 19th, isn't it? 19th of June at the the West Ham football ground stroke stadium there.
The London Stadium, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. The London Stadium. I was struggling there, wasn't I? But they inhabit it, don't they? But anyway, it's that place. Good. Okay. So anyone else got any OBs? Who's that? Who's a hand up there? Oh, it's just Matt. Okay, Matt, you haven't got another. Your hand's up still. No. Okay.
Sorry, old hand.
Alrighty, so I think that's the AOB's done. I'd just like to have a few moments to think about any reflections we might have to want to share on how we've gone about our business today. How's it all felt? Chris Kennedy, your hand's popped up. Super.
I think what just happened when we ended up all agreeing with Laura kind of reminded me of the what was it? I agree with Nick when the 2010 general election was happening, because there's someone positioned in a place where they can see everything that's sort of going on, and they say the right things about it that actually all of us want to contribute to, and that we do need to keep remembering that we're about the outcomes for what, approaching 1/3 people, probably not quite that much, because the census won't record it as that high, but certainly if you it's a lot more than that if you include all the visitors who come into the city and work in the city, and we have to look after their health and care sometimes as well, and thinking about prevention and keeping people as healthy as they can all the way through actually is what we, and especially at this board, are about, rather than waiting till they get ill and treating them then. And we just need to keep reminding ourselves of that, and I thought we just did that quite well then. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So I've got Honor and then a couple of others. So over to you, Honor.
Thank you. I think it's been a fascinating meeting, and there are those of us who've been through the local Outbreak board as well. I think I am continually stunned by the quality of the papers when I know people are so busy doing so many important things, but I think we're getting to a point where the papers really tell the story, and I think that's really impressive, and I think all the authors should be congratulated, and we should hand thanks on to teams for that. I think we ourselves managed well, but I suppose for me we began with John's irritation, and I heard it, we all heard it, and I think it's a mark for something, isn't it? It's a mark that John is holding in his mind, the sense of feeling a bit pushed away or handed off, and we can do better than that. It's about us remembering that co-production should be going through all of this like a stick of rock, and there is nobody to blame for this, but it vanishes, and there's attrition when we're all phenomenally busy doing lots and lots of key and important things. And I just think we have to remember who we are, and the City and Hackney way has been to co-produce and to be kind. And so I think there were elements of that really shone out today, and they are like stars, and we just need to hold on to that stuff. So yes, and I do agree with Laura, but that's an example of those things, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Honor. So Chris Lovett and then Siobhan. Chris.
I mean, again, it's to reflect on the two parts of the meeting and try and sort of pull them together. I mean, it's been great to hear the conversations that have taken place in the second part of the meeting, and obviously there is a real desire and aspiration to kind of get back to the agenda that COVID disrupted so much. I suppose my fear, and I really hope I'm wrong, and that we don't have a very difficult third wave, is just that word of caution that there probably is a few things that we now need to delay immediately to create some space to do some of the highlights that we talked about in the Outbreak Control Board over the next 2 to 4 weeks, and that is very much those vaccinations for the priority unvaccinated. But then just to kind of reflect upon, if we do get a third wave, I mean, if we are back into where we've been twice before, we just have to reflect upon, again, giving people permission to delay and stop doing things whilst we focus on the immediacy of that pandemic. So it's really that, as much as we all want to be back into normal, and hearing so much of that aspiration and sometimes slightly frustrated aspiration is great, because we're all wanting to do the right things in the right way. If that third wave does hit us in the way that it's quite possible to, either in Hackney and the city or London, we've just got to give ourselves that permission to reprioritise what we can stop doing to create space to cope with what's going to be coming down the line.
Thank you, Chris. Siobhan.
Thanks. I mean, that's very profound what Chris has just said, I think. And I guess the other thing I just feel is change. You know, there's just so much change. And, you know, that these are massive things to manage. And I guess it is something about how we take care of each other, because, you know, it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And, you know, you sort of get your head above water slightly, and then, you know, you just worry what's coming next sometimes. So yeah, so I just wanted to say that, really, and we just need to look after each other.
No, very well said, John.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and thank you to Honor as well for kind of bringing up that point I made earlier. I think I should also say that it's kind of, this is also a very, very good system in terms of trying to want to involve the public as well. If I look to my colleagues further east in the other systems, they're not as involved as Health Watches are as we are here. I do appreciate that. But at the same time, I probably will kind of continue to make noise because of my anxieties about what I'm seeing. So it's kind of, but I feel like there are receptive ears, and that's the important thing. And we can get here, but we just need to keep pushing, and we just need to keep being ambitious on this as well. But I do appreciate what all you're doing, in spite of my irritation sometimes.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for sharing those thoughts. I think they're really worth spending some time reflecting on. So thank you. From my perspective, I should just, before I close the meeting, just say to everyone that I'm come to the end of my 6 months of chairing. So I have to hand over the metaphorical talking stick to Randall Anderson for his next 6 months. So thank you for a couple of claps there. Thank you very much. Hopefully, it's been personally, it's a wonderful group to kind of chair, and I hopefully, you know, contribute to the general work that we do together. So thank you all for all you've done over those 6 months and will continue to do. So we ought to finish there on that note. So I did see a couple of hands flick up, but they've gone down again. Okay, good. So that's it. Thank you very much. The area subcommittee now will meet for its first go at meeting. It will meet in the spirit of collectivism. Quite happy we're going to carry on this call. You don't need to log in anywhere else. You're more than welcome to join us. I'm not sure that it's going to be a particularly long meeting because we've had a chance to look at the terms of reference before, but we just need to formally sign them off. So yeah, I'll leave you a moment to log off, and others who want to stay. And yeah, that certainly includes the areas of committee members. So excellent. Good. Oh, well, that's actually gave me a moment to read some nice things in the chat. So thank you for those who've done that. So now we have an agenda which is over here. I printed out. Now it's in the papers. It says Sue's chairing, but in fact that was before we agreed last month that it wouldn't be Sue. It'd be me in my capacity as the CCG chair. Well, sitting in Hackney chair for the NEL CCG, and that would be why I would continue to chair this group for these next 9 months, and continue to work to see how its work continues once it's folded into the ICS. But today, that last bit is for another day. For today, we just need to make sure we conduct ourselves according to our terms of reference for the next 9 months or so. And also, I think we have a task, Jonathan, you'll remind me, to actually elect a deputy chair.
That's right.
And I know that we haven't actually had a discussion about that. Can I just check something before I open it up to any questions from the members? In terms of the membership in the tour now, I'm on the let's scroll through. It talks about the area managing director, and in fact, I guess that is the ICP managing director or other similarly senior ICP lead. Can we? I mean, because obviously that title is not quite what Siobhan's covering that work in many regards, so I see hers. But are we also talking about Tracy being the person who's actually the executive lead who would be on this group? I need to clarify that in my own head.
Can I give you my thoughts on that, Mark? I think the reason for the wording being like that is because this is where the statutory conflicts come into play, because this is the CCG area committee. It needs to be members of the CCG, and that's where a chief executive of a provider has an inherent conflict. So I think that's the root of the wording. So it's fine for the wider ICPB board, obviously, because that includes all of us as partners. But the technicality of this area committee is that it's a subcommittee of the formal CCG membership.
Yes, of course. Of course. Thank you, Susan. Jonathan.
Yeah, just to say that that's what the lawyers have told us, and they said that if you really wanted it to be the Tracy figure, then you could, but you would be likely to have lots of potential issues around conflicts arising that would make it difficult and could make meetings inquirate. So they felt that, given we have an excellent choice between two, that it's much more straightforward to have Siobhan carrying out this role.
Well, I mean, that's great. It's absolutely nothing personal in any of that. It's just a clarification, really. So that's clear to me now. Thank you.
I think it's just a technicality, really, at this stage, because, again, we're reminded that this area committee is very short-lived.
Yes, and actually, now you say it, I remember it now. So it's helpful to be reminded. OK, other thoughts? Yeah, thumbs up for Siobhan. Yeah, could go with that. OK, so do we want to sign off the tour first or elect a deputy? Jonathan, do you want to guide me?
I think perhaps elect a deputy first, and then there's just one thing I want to say about the tour. But
fine.
I don't know how long you want to give for speeches for the hustings.
Well, yeah. So we haven't. Unless you have you canvassed for views on this, Jonathan? I mean, I can give you my thought on it, and it would be along the lines. In other area subcommittees are being chaired by the lay member, and so to some degree it makes sense if to nominate you, Sue, if you would be happy to do that, to align with ease. I don't see it as a sort of, a huge role, but nonetheless, technically I think it feels that would make sense.
Yeah, I would agree.
I'm fine with that. I think probably, again, from a confliction point of view, that's a good thing to do, because again, it's a non-conflicted person.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's fine if everybody's happy with that.
I should say
it's a technicality again, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and Steve Collins, who's had to leave, did send me an email saying he was happy to sign off the tour because he had to give apologies for not being here at the moment. So he's I can't believe he won't support that decision as well. Okay, so can we all sort of say aye in some formal way?
Aye.
Marvellous. Anyway, that's decided then. Jonathan, you wanted to have a quick word about the tour before we sign that off?
The only thing to say is that depending on when you last looked at it, all the systems in North East London have changed their terms of reference on quoracy. So previously it said there needed to be one from each of the constituencies, so a manager, a clinician and a layperson, and it now says just any 3 people. And that was because they were worried that there would be decisions that clinicians could be conflicted on, and that would make quoracy difficult. So it's been agreed across North East London that 3 out of the 6 is fine. So that's the only significant change to terms of reference people might have seen before. And Chris's point about the reserved decisions, there is as Chris has pointed out in the chat, there's an annex at the end of the terms of reference which sets those out.
It's there, isn't it? But we've rehearsed the discussion about where it will conduct its work, and it would be very exceptional that it wouldn't do so within the context of the ICPB anyway. We've also rehearsed the discussion about the tour a lot last month and also in between the meetings. So I'm content, if others are, to say we agree them. Yeah, Should we have another kind of random noise, show of thumbs, generally?
Yes, agreed, Mark.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. So I think that's it. It's that, Jonathan, again, bit of guidance. Are we done?
I think so.
I think so too. Well, good. Well done, everybody. And onwards and
Sorry,
upwards.
can I just ask a dumb question before we finish? So now that you're no longer chair of ICPB, if we were going to make a area committee decision, then you would become the chair of that decision. Is that how that will work? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, fine.
Yes.
That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. We would manage that. Obviously, it does. You know, managing the forward plan of work and how decisions are recorded in minutes, etc. You know, is another level of complexity here, but that's work to be managed. We can do that. Good. All right. Super. Well,
can I just make a very minor point for the governance folk who I think are still on the call? When we get to the July meeting, can we try to make sure that all the documentation has the right titles and organisational titles? And I appreciate it's very muddled in the last few months because of the transition, but at the moment there are some slightly strange contortions in one or two of the titles and organisational names. So we just need to have a quick review through.
We will. No, that's no
Thank
problem.
you.
So we'll make sure.
good. Yeah. Good point. Thank you. Right.
Mark, does this meeting merit reflections, or is it too short?
Well, if you have
Every
something on your
meeting
mind,
merits
you've got a moment,
reflection.
you can share it. No, I'm content to go make a cup of tea at this stage.
Fair enough, I think.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Well, that's very good, everyone. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Onwards and upwards. Take care. See you all soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.